face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. This nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Policy Dialogue series with alumni, staff, faculty, and students from the University of Maryland. The views expressed do not represent official positions of the school or alumni network. Our goal is to discuss global issues and how we can solve local, national, and international challenges. We are recording this on December 3rd, 2020. My name is Evan Papp. I graduated from the School of Public Policy, class of 2011, with a focus on international security and economic policy. And I'm the executive producer of Empathy Media Lab, which creates content on labor, political economy, arts, and culture. Joining me is Dr. Julie Greene, who is professor of history at the University of Maryland, College Park, focusing on labor, immigration, and empire. She received a BA degree in history from the University of Michigan, a BA and MA degree in history from the University of Cambridge, and a PhD in history from Yale University. She is the author of numerous books, including The Canal Builders, Making America's Empire at the Panama Canal. Julie is the founding co-director of the Center for Global Migration Studies at the University of Maryland, and she is also the past president of the Labor and Working Class History Association. Julie, I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. So could you talk a little bit about your background and how you first got interested in labor history and why you think others should care about this?
Absolutely. So I love history, and I've always been interested as a historian in how power works, and especially interested in thinking about history from the bottom up, thinking about how oppressed people, whether they're oppressed as a result of their socioeconomic class or their race or their gender, how they deal with structures of power and how they find ways to, exercise some agency. So all of that sort of led me to labor history. It was a very particularly hot area of research when I was an undergraduate. I'm originally from a small town in Nebraska, so people always say, how could a kid from Nebraska end up studying labor? But for me, it was just an entry point into a whole range of fascinating questions about how society works, about the history of capitalism and workers' place in it. And of course, as the United States has entered the 21st century, we've seen that workers' rights have eroded tremendously. Workers in the United States have fewer rights than just about anywhere in the global north. And so that makes it especially fascinating to understand the history of workers and think about how we got to that point today.
And coming from the Midwest, I also came from Michigan and did my undergrad at University of Michigan. And there was some populist growth from, I believe, like the farmers in the Midwest, in Minnesota and Nebraska. Was that any part of your consciousness growing up, or were you growing up did you know anyone in unions growing up, or was this something more of focusing on like systematic power that you kind of started exploring later on?
Interesting question. No, it was actually kind of the opposite. I didn't grow up around people who were in unions, quite the opposite. Although I'm from Nebraska, which is farming community, my father was actually an executive at one of the largest factories in Lincoln. And so if I was exposed to labor issues, it was kind of in the opposite way. It was because my father he was the chief of accounting at this Goodyear factory, and his name was on all the checks. And I remember just kind of wondering about this place where he worked and wondering about the workers' lives. And he would come home sometimes, kind of proud of the work he had done, working a double shift when the workers were on strike to help break the strike. And so I think that kind of combined with just intellectual interests when I went to college, you know, it wasn't a reaction against my family background. It was more just that this was a hot area. And growing up, I had gotten my curiosity aroused by watching him do his factory experience every day.
And before I move on to the next question about Cambridge, what was it like focusing on labor at that time? Because it seems like that was kind of the turn towards Reagan and Thatcher and some of the policies that really attacked some of the rights of organized labor. And yeah, I'm kind of curious about the culture back then.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I really got fascinated with labor issues while I was a student at Cambridge. I was studying British and European history then. And what really took me to labor issues was touring towns in the Welsh mining valleys. And so I got fascinated by the miners' experiences and wrote a thesis on that. And that was in the early 80s. So it was right as Thatcherism was taking over and miners were feeling more and more desperate. And then when I came back to the US, I decided to switch and do US history instead of European, but keep the labor focus. And started grad school at Yale, working with a person who was at that time pretty much the premier labor historian in the US, David Montgomery. And you know, that was the heyday of Reaganism. And I remember then some of my union friends would say, well, Reagan's in office, it's going to be a horrible time for union organizing or anything progressive. We might as well just stop trying and go raise a family now and try again in a few years. Of course, in retrospect, Reagan was an important turning point, but by today's standards, he would be seen as quite the moderate, you know, because this country has shifted so radically to the right and has so turned against workers' rights since that time.
So you teach a course called Workers of Global Capitalism, which examines the field of global labor and working class history and its relationship to the history of global capitalism. So could you discuss what this course is about and why you wanted to teach it?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it's one of the funnest classes I teach. Let me just preface by saying that my interest in history is now very much about global relationships and transnational history. The discipline of history has always been one that really is bounded by nation states. You know, history emerged as a discipline in order to tell the story of different nation states. And so one of the most exciting things happening in our discipline in the last 20 years or so has been trying to problematize how we think about how history works and realize that it's not just contained neatly within territorial boundaries, but history flows, people flow across territorial boundaries, capital does, culture, commodities, all of it flows across. And so there's been a movement among historians to think more globally, more transnationally about those flows that cut across boundaries. So that's what my work centers on. My last book on the making of the Panama Canal is an example of that. So this course on global capitalism and labor just tries to put that all into effect with our graduate students, give them a chance to really try to think conceptually about what it would mean to analyze the working class in a global environment. Think about the US working class, but think about it in interaction with workers all over the world. How are our lives, how is the labor of people in the United States, for example, shaped by what's happening in Asia, what's happening in Latin America, in Europe? We know that we know that capitalism is global, right? Increasingly global. Capital is moving rapidly around the world. Supply chains are shaping every aspect of our lives today. Our lives are so connected to what workers in Bangladesh or Pakistan are doing. And so it's really important for historians to think that way too, to think about conceptualizing the working class as a global class. So that's what the course does. It looks globally at capitalism, but it also looks globally at workers' lives, workers' agency, and looks at efforts to connect workers across. That's one of the greatest challenges today with supply chains, is figuring out a way to build a labor movement that can deal with global supply chains. So we take up those kinds of questions.
I think one of my favorite quotes from Lincoln is where he talks about how labor precedes capital, and that without labor, you can't create value in capital. It's labor that actually is the one that forms capital. And oftentimes, as you just said, labor and capital are separated. Just like I think it used to be political economy, and now it's just economics, and they've taken out the politics and kind of obscured the idea that politics is central to economics as well. But teaching on capitalism, after Francis Fukuyama said, the end of history, it's almost like capitalism is supreme and this is the only system. And obviously that thought has been, undermined with current events. However, focusing on a critique of capitalism in public universities, this may be a different discussion, but have you had challenges at times critiquing capitalism in a very pro-capitalistic culture and setting?
Not so much, because I think, I know that there's some people on the right who think that the professors are brainwashing people from a liberal perspective or whatever. And I always think that what they don't get is that a good professor, all we want is students who are engaged and critically thinking. And so I love it when I have a student who sees things differently from the way I do. And if I'm talking about workers' rights and they are from the business school and say, well, you're not giving enough attention to employers' rights or employers' prerogatives, I value it because it brings another voice into the debate. It helps students articulate their differences and get more sophisticated in their thinking. So no, I haven't felt that as a problem at all.
So focusing on policy a little bit, migration, as you mentioned, and immigration has been going on since the beginning of time. The movement of peoples is as natural as anything human, I guess. And I guess, what historical examples could you cite where governments have gotten the question of immigration right? Or at least, what's some of the best of worst immigration policies? Or even, what are some of the worst policies you've seen, maybe even in the Panama Canal book that you wrote?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a funny question, only because it's pretty hard to answer. I mean, it's hard to say when people have gotten it terribly right, to be honest. I might frame it a little bit differently about how can we see as historians when immigration policies become more fair or more open. They tend to be more open when a country needs the labor. And so in the US in the 19th century, today in some countries like Spain and Italy feel like they need workers, so they're relatively more open. But the problem comes, and one of the things my students study a lot in my undergraduate classes is when countries decide it's too much, what shapes the policies as they become stricter. And that's where, especially in the case of the US, which I know the best, we really see race and ethnicity shaping things so much. A commissioner of immigration once said, and this quote to me can be used to explore almost any period of US history. He said, "The real problem is that we want willing subjects who will do the work without thinking. But some people want people who will become good citizens. And the problem is those are not the same people." And that sort of tension is at so much at the heart of not just US immigration history, but really all of US history, needing people who will work for cheap and not complain and easily disciplined, but then also thinking, well, we need to build a society. And those same people who we hire because they work cheap aren't necessarily who we want as our citizens. And from that tension comes, all these efforts to keep out certain people, to keep out the Chinese, or to end Italian and Jewish immigration. Or today we see really a rebirth of this kind of restrictionist sentiment where, Steve Miller and the people advising President Trump have worked very, very hard to try and ensure that only people who are like us being white people from Northern and Western European countries, are the only ones who are able to enter the country. So race and ethnicity and anxieties about those and notions of who deserves to be an American has shaped things all along the way.
Even the most cold-hearted cynic, when they look at immigration, I sometimes question them on the aspect of demographic crises that is being seen in many, many countries, where when you have a very large elder population, and all of Western Europe, China, Japan, they all have demographic crises that the population is not growing fast enough to take care of some of the oldest people who are retiring. And in the US, the immigration is actually the only reason we don't have a demographic crisis is because of the immigration. And so it's a national asset. And the other aspect is, on one side you have, on the most flagrant labor violations is chattel slavery, where you're preventing your labor from learning literacy. But in some ways, that's asset stripping your labor, to the point where you want your labor to be able to solve problems as quickly as possible and to develop new means of production and to new solutions to the problems that you face. And one is about control, and the other one is about the potentiality of labor. And you want to invest in your labor population. You want to grow your labor population. So on the coldest calculating ideas of national security and economics, it seems like it's just a no-brainer. You want to invest in your labor population. You want immigration, and the fact that immigrants still want to come here despite all of the problems, that's a huge asset that the United States still has, despite the last 4 years of anti-immigration sentiment.
It is. I mean, you're absolutely right about the demographic boost from immigration in this country, and yet, as a result of that, I think one thing we don't pay enough attention to is that we have this crisis happening in the country right now, which is unprecedented in our history, which is having somewhere around 12 to 15 million people who live in the shadow because of their immigration status, because they don't have documents, and the ways in which that allows them to be exploited, to work for low wage, to lack fundamental rights that we take for granted as constitutional rights if we're citizens, is a huge, huge problem. And I think one of the things I really focus on in my teaching is understanding what that means for us as Americans to have that. I think the anti-immigrant movement has done a really effective job of dehumanizing those people, by portraying them as, illegal aliens, by creating this dynamic, this sense that to give them more rights is to diminish our rights as citizens. And I think we need to communicate the opposite message, that it diminishes this country to have so many people living in those circumstances. It diminishes our democracy, our sense of ourselves as an equitable nation, a nation where people have rights. So that's one of the things that my students are really concerned about in the classes I've been teaching recently, is how can we communicate a better message about that and work harder to deal with that problem.
So I went onto your Twitter feed and I saw that you tweeted something out about your migration studies class that you just wrapped up, and that you had a really hot discussion with the students, and even going to the point of discussing about open borders and things like that. I've taught a little bit, and I absolutely, you feed off the energy of the students. And can you talk a little bit about this last class that you wrote about on Twitter?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I've just had such a great time teaching this class. So it's a lower level class, Introduction to Immigration and Migration Studies. So it's interdisciplinary, but because I'm a historian, it has a pretty strong historical focus. To make it interdisciplinary, the way I've structured it is we began with the present day to understand what's been happening around immigration in the last 4 years. And then we went back into history to try to teach the students how to use history to understand and critique the present. And so their assignments have all been to write not traditional academic papers, but to write op-eds where they connect the history of immigration in the US to the present day. This was our last class of the semester where we'd be having a lecture and discussion, and we were focusing on efforts by immigrants and their allies to change that conversation, that message I was just talking about. And as we discussed, one of the students raised the question of, well, why do we even have a border? Why can't we let people cross borders whenever they want to? And she made a pitch for that. And so, of course, that became a hot debate. I have a lot of criminology majors in the class and econ majors and a couple of business school students. And so they had a lot of views on this, and a lot of ideas about why we can't, why a nation state doesn't want to have an open border, right? That it could generate more human trafficking, it could generate more of a national security problem. But on the other hand, the students who were arguing for open borders had a strong case too. And they said, well, look, if capital can flow across borders wherever it wants in the Western Hemisphere, people should be able to move too. Why do you let capital flow to the places where workers can be paid the least and not let the workers move to wherever the jobs are the best? So those were the kinds of positions we were debating.
Well, I really hope people from the School of Public Policy look at what you're doing and check out the Migration Center as well. And so in closing, looking into the future of labor and migration, where do you see opportunity and hope?
Well, I think we're in a really tough period for both, for some of the reasons, we've talked about. This country is obviously in the worst position it's been in terms of either immigrants' rights or labor rights in decades. So I think where I would look to for hope is has to start with sending out a better message about those things. Think about what are the fundamental rights that we have come to assume we deserve as citizens. And think about, do workers really have those rights once they enter the workplace? The answer is no. Very often they don't. If they don't have the right to a union, they don't have the right to freedom of assembly or freedom of speech. They can be fired without cause. So that right to a union, that right to organize collectively, should be seen as just as fundamental as any other right that we have. I think communicating that message, and likewise communicating a message that we're all hurt by having 12 million people in our country who have to live in the shadows as almost sort of an inferior caste, is a problem for me and a problem for you, Evan. I think that's where we start. That wouldn't get us all the way there. There are a few other things that would have to happen for it to be truly a brighter day for workers or for immigrants, but that would be a good start.